When I say catechism, how do you feel? What do you feel? Catechism. Those of you who grew up in the high church, so to speak, you might be wondering, oh no, don't bring me there. It was boring and it was most excruciating time in my life. If you are more relatively newer Christians, or that you grew up in a what we call low church, you'll say, catechism? What is catechism? Is that something Catholic? Catechism. That's something that we are to talk about today. And for the interest of time, let me just define three things real quick. Catechism, catechism proper, and also ecclesial catechesis. Those are the three things I'll define very briefly. The term comes from Greek word katekeo. It's got a range of meaning, but it sounds something like this: resound exactly, or to learn by nuanced repetitions, or teach in systematic manner, or to share a communication that one receives. These are some of the ranges of meaning of katekeo in the New Testament as well as the other writings during the time. So catechism, it's simple. Catechism is a booklet, if you want to call it, or a book like Heidelberg Catechism that actually talks about the essence of the faith. Right? That's where the Jude 3 talks about the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. So what are the essence of the faith? That's what is written in what we call catechism. Right? And then there's catechism proper. Catechism proper is that a very serious, sometimes it took 2 years before somebody was to be baptized in the early church. It is a rigorous, intensive training where that people of God who are to be baptized to come together and study and be actually involved even in what we call exorcism as well, with sponsors and so forth. So that's what we call catechism proper. But then this notion of ecclesial catechesis is something that I want to draw our attention to this morning. It is a comprehensive educational and formative processes that all Christians would be involved in for rest of their lives, punctuated by the catechism proper to begin with, but the whole community of faith would come together and they would rehearse this together. So it is not just for the baptized to be going through catechism proper, but yet it is the whole community of God rallying together, coming alongside of the new Christians so that they would repeat this process together for rest of their lives. That's what I call the ecclesial catechesis, so that they would have this engage in lifelong process that is truly alternative to what this society had to offer, so that they could truly live into their identity, which is that they are truly kingdom citizens of God. So this morning, for the interest of time, that I just want to highlight a few issues pertaining to nature and function of this ecclesial catechesis that the reformers tried to rediscover from these three passages that Aaron read for us, so that we can draw some contemporary significance for our church today and future of our church. So first, Luke chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. It's a one sentence in its original language, and it says this: the things that were fulfilled or accomplished according to what God had promised in the Old Testament. Verse 2 reads this: just as they were delivered to us or handed down to us, okay? And there's this formula. There's a rich tradition that is being passed down. And then here, verse 3, Luke declares to Theophilus, I want to pass this on to you. So catechesis is truly, right? It is resounding, listening with the echoes, and so that they can pass on to next generation. That's what catechism was, catechesis was. This formula of the having delivered or having received, or that we have received so that we are to pass on, does not appear just in Luke, but also in 1 Corinthians 15, right? When Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and for the church and the dead and so forth, it is truly catechetical because it reads this: "For what I received, I passed on to you," of first importance. It is all about not just proclaiming with words, but proclaiming with the whole being as a community of faith. This is what we have received. Therefore, we are to pass on this to you. So there's a sort of a resounding it exactly with our whole being, or sharing the communication that we once received. That's what we see in Luke chapter 1 as well as 1 Corinthians 13. And as we know, for the interest of time, if I can just share that Paul, who spent 18 months in Corinth, he says this about recounting on his life. He says this in 1 Corinthians 2:2. It says this, is that I wanted to know nothing among them except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That in itself is the crux of the gospel. And he is to testify to it, and also we are to proclaim it, as Colossians 1 talks about. So both Luke and Paul, the crux of catechesis is this, that we not only begin with the gospel, or we just continue on with the gospel, but we end with the gospel, that Jesus Christ and Him crucified. So the gospel became not only something that we merely talk about, but yet gospel is the frame of our very own life and the life of our community, life together as God's people. So let's fast forward, because we are concluding our Reformation series today. Let's fast forward to the 16th century. Luther and Calvin, among other reformers, they realized that there was a desperate need for educating the children and also lay people of the rudiments of faith. So what did they do? It's really interesting that just about all the reformers actually wrote some kind of catechism, okay, the booklet, the catechisms in their own vernaculars and also in their own context. Just about all of them. But mind you, it is not just the reformers who all of a sudden decide to write these catechisms, but during the medieval church that centuries preceded it, they also had a plethora of catechisms of all sorts. And the formula, interestingly enough, during the medieval church and also the reformers, formulas for the catechisms were quite similar. They were not so widely different. So we talk about 3 C's and 1 S when we talk about catechisms. First is creed, namely the Apostles' Creed. And second is cult, the Lord's Prayer. And third, code, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. And S stands for sacraments. So these are the 3 C's and 1 S that really were the backbone of the catechism. So, and it usually in that order. So it starts with creed, cult, and code. But Luther, interestingly, changes that formula a bit. He rather than putting creed, cult, code, he starts with code, creed, and cult. And you can see where that's coming from. Luther says this: 3 things a man must need to know to be saved: The law shows man his disease. The creed tells him where to find his medicines. The Lord's Prayer teaches him how to seek it and appropriate it. So this is how Luther approached how we are to really think about the rudiments of faith. So it's not just the content, but yet the ordering of these C's really were quite significant as well. But then Calvin goes back to the creed and cult and code. So this is what he wanted to talk about. He says, well, the creed is needed so that we can trust God. And then the code, so that we can honor God by doing his will. And then cult, so that we can truly involve in invocation through worship and honoring God. And then comes sacraments through which that we offer thanksgiving to God. Well, what's really interesting is that in his catechisms, there are two of them, but yet he really did not talk much about the theology of predestination or the 5 tenets of Calvinism, the tulips, so-called. That's really interesting, that he only saw these 3 C's and S as the essence of the rudiments of faith. And then comes, I'm sure those of you, if you can tolerate catechism, we tolerate Heidelberg Catechism. That's the one that we actually try to say, yeah, I can handle the Heidelberg Catechism. I remember spending a year and a half with my family after every dinner for a year and a half. It was an arduous task. Although my kids and we all had every evening we had time of prayer and singing and lessons and so forth. Going through Heidelberg Catechism for a year and a half, I like to say, was the toughest in our family life. So much so that, can I be frank with you? I was so fed up with my kids' disinterest. I was upset. I was angry. I remember tearing the Heidelberg Catechism into half and said, no more of this. I still remember that. And of course, I had to ask God for forgiveness and for our children for forgiveness. But yet, as they recall, Dad, yeah, we were not too interested in the whole details of it. You said it was only for intended for 52 weeks, but you went on for a year and a half. So be it. So Heidelberg Catechism was commissioned, and it's written by 2 professors at University of Heidelberg, right? Ursinus is one of them. And what they did was that divided into 3 sections for 52 weeks so that people would go through this for the whole year. That's what they did. But what people say about the Heidelberg Catechism is that it is truly the apex of Reformed catechism. That there is a sense of striking balance and also beauty of bringing together this wonderful 3 C's and 1 S. And for the interest of time, I'm going to just ask you, it is free online. You can access all kinds of catechisms there because they don't usually sell very well. But yet, we are celebrating 500 years of Reformation. I want to encourage you to download it and look at it, and you can truly have a wonderful time with God with it. But what's notable about that Heidelberg Catechism was this, is that it was quite personal and experiential. That it truly tried to get people involved. And that sometimes that they call you as a son, or this time son and daughters. Listen. It was very personal in nature. And also it is quite existential, that they understood the signs of times and all. So much so that I like to make a comparison with the Augustine of Hippo, who espoused this notion of catechesis. Is very similar, which we'll come back to it a little later on. Okay? So all to say, catechisms or catechesis is intended that we have received the gospel and that we are to cherish it, and it is our duty and delight for us to pass it on to our generation through our whole being. That is what this catechesis was intended for. But then we will soon, a little later, talk about the fact that although the reformers tried their very best, the jury's out. Whether that true, the reformations that we celebrate after 500 years, whether there was a truly the genuine impact in the lives of the people in the pews. And we'll come back to that a little later on. So now, Acts chapter 2. Verses 42 through 47. It is a very familiar passage that is a portrait of the first Christian church, testifying to the unity and peace and joy and the praise of God. We can almost infer that this is the portrait of the early church that it is for us to perhaps emulate in its structure. We observe that these Christians were steadily devoted themselves in four things: apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of the bread, and the prayer. They were largely in communal and liturgical in nature. Elsewhere, I wrote about this in 4 Ds. These are the doctrine, delight, devotion, and duty. These are the 4 things that the Acts talks about. Or elsewhere, I talked about the fact that it's 4 we's. We believe, we live, we celebrate, and we pray. Those are the 4 elements of this catechesis that they were engaged in. But when we think about, just for the interest of time, just the teaching portion of these 4 elements, much of the times that we tend to bring in what we understand to be what teaching is in this modern day and age, and we imbue that into what we think that Bible talks about what teaching is. So for some of us, it might be just an impartation or transmission of a certain facts, or it might be a socialization that you think about, and so on and so forth. But from scriptures, it is, in my mind, it is instructive for us to bring together all the words and usages of this notion of teaching. And there are many words that actually talk about teaching. And if we are to bring them together, I see 4 main themes that I observe when it comes to teaching, especially teaching of the apostles. Sure, instruction is there. We're talking about exposition and proclamation of the gospel and the rudiments of the gospel, but also secondly, the training part. That entails actually a significant portion of what we mean by teaching. Here we think about discipline, admonition, and discernment. And third, we also need to think about this notion of wisdom when we think about teaching. It involves illumination, guidance, and discernment as well. Lastly, nurture. It's a traditioning, nourishing, and also persuading. These are all the elements when we think about the teaching as we see in scriptures. And I can assure you that this kind of teaching was characterized by the first century and also ancient Christians. It was not some kind of option for them to engage in some kind of teaching in some nebulous way or teaching in their preference. But for them, this teaching needed to be holistic in its nature because their life depended upon it, literally. Let me just illustrate. Commenting on the Didache, that probably this is what we think is the first catechetical material that the church has used in the late first century. And it starts with two ways, the way of life and the way of death. But commenting on this Didache, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, opines this. One of the lasting legacies of the early church is the recognition that doctrine, prayer, and ethics don't exist in tidy, separate compartments. Each one shapes the others. And in the church, in any age, we should not be surprised if we become hazy about our doctrines at a time when we are less clear about our priorities as a community, or if we become less passionate about service, forgiveness, and peace when we have stopped thinking clearly about the true and eternal character of God. And he continues, the early Christians believed that if Jesus of Nazareth was the Lord, no one else could be Lord over them. And therefore, no one could overrule his authority. To speak of Jesus as the Lord of Lords was to say that the Christians' decisions could not be overridden by anyone. That is why the early Christian movement was so threatening and so simply baffling to the Roman authorities. Insofar as there is a struggle, it is against our own willingness to let other authorities overrule Christ. In the early church, that was a life and death matter, and it still is for Christians in some parts of the world today, end quote. So here, the catechesis in the early church and the ancient church really was about learning and practicing and ready to die well for Christ. It involved 2 years of intense training, perhaps similar to MDiv curriculum per se, with all the other things that are added to it. It is not just the new Christians, but new Christians and all the community of God coming together, rehearsing this life together, and live accordingly, so that that truly is what they're claiming. This is our first reality, and this world is not our home. They were truly trying to be and live as kingdom Christians, kingdom citizens. Yet the reformers of the 16th century found themselves in a very different setting in Europe than the early church or the ancient church. That they found themselves in what we call Christendom, where it is assumed that everybody is Christians and we live based on Christian values and Christian ways of doing things. Technically, they did not need to, in a comprehensive manner, overhaul the way of life in the church. They themselves were as God's people. They did not exactly have to figure out how can we be alternative, radical, called out community of faith for the purpose of this holistic catechesis. What they needed, what they saw that they needed was coming up with some good catechisms. So that using all the social institutions of that time, families and school, government, and so on and so forth, so that they will all engage in catechetical processes based on using these catechisms. Because they had the institutions, but they also were able to enforce, mind you, they were able to enforce that you all engage in this catechetical activities. Whether it's Luther's Germany or Calvin's Geneva, yes, for the elites and pastors and learned people, we could safely say, yes, the catechisms worked, whatever that means. But we have to pause and wonder whether it really worked. The reformation of heart and the church and the whole being has actually taken place in the ordinary plebeian Christians. That's something we might have to wonder. Let me quote this observation. If in terms of territorial rulers and city councils going over to the evangelical side, then one can say that these catechisms surely contributed to the success and helped to spread and to consolidate the Reformation. But in terms of a widespread deepening of religious knowledge and piety among the laity, these catechisms were failure. Based on visitation records from the late half of the 16th century, scholars found no improvement in religious knowledge and no great concern for religious matters among the laity in religious knowledge, and no great concern for religious matters among the laity. I think I repeated myself. In Lutheran territories. Most attempts at Christian indoctrination of the masses were met with substantial indifference, boredom, and even resistance. It had to be mandatory. Some form of coercion was necessary. By and large, the masses were not buying what the elite had to sell, end quote. This is from Oxford Encyclopedia of the Reformation. What are we to make of this Reformation as we celebrate 500 years of Reformation? Could it be that we thought that if we can teach the right things, if we can help people rediscover right things as in rudiments of faith, that we assume that their hearts and their lives would change? In the process along the way, have we forgotten, perhaps, this lifelong process of catechesis that is to function as the grammar and generative rule, or the very fabric of the life and mission of God's people? I wonder. So that we would be engaged in this lifelong, lifetime, and continually being converted and nurtured and transformed by this living tradition. Have we forgotten about that? Let me conclude with Jeremiah 6:16 for the interest of time. Yesterday I had 17 pages of single-spaced notes, and I said, I cannot do that, Lord. I cannot speak very fast, and I do have a heavenly accent. So I had to cut it, and now I'm still cutting it. Because, we're talking about 2,000 years of church history. So please bear with me. It reads this: the ancient path, right, that is revealed to Moses and early prophets. And it is an invitation, right, by Jeremiah. It's by God through Jeremiah. Invitation for them to take the ancient path, to contemplate the wisdom of our past. It might not be exactly the most efficient, relevant, logical, learned, or professional ways of doing Christianity. But yet it says this ancient way is the good way. What would that look like? Here it says this. There are 4 verbs here. Stand, look, ask, walk. And here we know this walk is truly a metaphor of a holy and holistic patterned living based on the gospel. And it concludes as, you will find rest for your souls. That sound reminds us of what Jesus' invitation was like. But mind you, this is a plural. This is to the community of Jewish people. But I wonder, and I'm sure we all wonder, that us, the modern day evangelicals, that are we able to hear the counsel from the Lord, that we are to be engaged in this old path and walking in this good way? That could it be that it is not about efficiency, but possibly holy inefficiency of community sharing life together? That needs to be the crux, or should be the soil for this seed, Jesus Christ and Him crucified, for it to flourish. I wonder. Reform means reaching back and bringing into the future something that has been lost in the church, as we know. What would that be? I wondered. Perhaps one of the things that I observed from studying the catechesis and catechisms of the church throughout the church history is this. In the very first catechism, the Didache, the teachings of 12 apostles, actually had the Sermon on the Mount playing a prominent role of living out the alternate community as God's people. But as Christendom ushered in and so forth, and medieval church, and even the Reformation time, it is strangely absent in the catechisms of the church is the Sermon on the Mount, the alternate way of living life that Augustine just really longed for. And he says this, because this is not just about getting rudiments of the faith per se. He says this, behold, the theatrical extravaganzas of Christians, possessing their own theater, the basilica, own chorus numbers, the psalms, own epic drama, the scriptures. And this is in one of those countless catechetical sermons that Augustine pled with his people to live out this life together. Ecclesia semper reformanda, right? The church always to be reformed. Well, of course. But we have to wonder, what makes for authentic reform in the church, or even in our seminary and life together? We have to think about not so much what we need to capture and what we can capture with our mind, but yet strangely absent is our life together to accommodate to the fast-changing world. Could it be that we have lost the ancient, the holy, inefficient way of living out this ecclesial catechesis, but yet we have co-opted to embracing just the catechism's set of knowledge for us to receive and just project to others? It is something for us who are called to be leaders of the church might have to reflect on this occasion, so that Could it be that we have lost the vision of what it means to be the people of God while busying ourselves in knowing about God and doing things for God as if He needed our help? So this is our prayer and my prayer, and I hope that you can join me, is that may God the Father be merciful to us, that we would, by the power of the Holy Spirit, we may increasingly be transformed into the body of Christ, that together we may embody and testify to Jesus Christ and Him crucified for His kingdom.